It was a warm summer evening in 2015 when everything seemed ordinary in the heart of downtown Chicago. The streets pulsed with the sound of taxis, sirens, and Friday night laughter spilling out of crowded restaurants. But in one high-rise apartment, an ordinary night was about to turn into a mystery that would haunt the city for years. She was 29 years old, living alone in a corner unit with a view of the skyline. By all accounts, she had her life together. A stable job in marketing, a circle of close friends, a family that checked in with her often. She was described as outgoing, independent, and meticulous about routines. That night, her routine should have been simple. Meet two friends for dinner at a restaurant a few blocks away, a plan they had set days earlier. But she never arrived. At first, her friends assumed she was late, maybe caught in traffic, maybe held up at work. They called her phone, texted, but got no reply. What unsettled them quickly was that she wasn't the type to flake out without warning. By the time the restaurant closed, they knew something was wrong. Both of them walked to her building, thinking maybe she had fallen ill or simply forgotten. But when they reached the lobby, the doorman confirmed she hadn't signed out or been seen leaving. Inside her apartment, everything looked as though she had stepped out for only a moment. The front door was locked from the outside. Her phone was still plugged into its charger on the nightstand. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, wallet inside, credit cards untouched. Shoes she often wore were lined neatly by the door. Nothing suggested she had packed a bag. Nothing suggested she had left willingly. Later, neighbors would tell police they remembered hearing footsteps echoing down the hallway around midnight. A few said it sounded hurried, uneven, as though someone was carrying something. But no one saw her leave. The hallway security camera had a blind spot just beyond the elevators, a flaw in the system that became a devastating gap in the timeline. The last visual confirmation of her that day was hours earlier, her stepping into the building's lobby around 6 o'clock, smiling politely at the concierge before riding the elevator up. After that, she seemed to vanish into thin air. When her family was contacted, panic spread immediately. Her mother drove in from the suburbs that same night, arriving at the building just as officers were finishing their first sweep. She walked into the apartment, hoping to find her daughter simply asleep or out of touch. But the silence inside was unbearable. Her clothes still hung in the closet, makeup laid out neatly on the bathroom counter, the faint smell of perfume lingering in the air. Everything was in its place, except for her. Chicago police moved quickly to treat the case as suspicious. They knew the statistics. Adult disappearances often went unreported for days. But this case was different. Here was a woman, with strong family ties, an established career, no history of running away, and no signs of depression or planning to vanish. Officers immediately began canvassing the building, knocking on doors floor by floor. Some neighbors had nothing to report. Others admitted hearing small things, an elevator door opening after midnight, faint muffled voices in the corridor, even what one tenant described as a low dragging sound near the service hallway. None of these details fit together in any coherent way, but they painted an unsettling picture. Something unusual had happened in that building the night she disappeared. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By morning, reporters were outside the high-rise, filming the entrance as detectives moved in and out. Flyers with her face appeared on light poles, coffee shop windows, and train platforms across the loop. For co-workers, friends, and relatives, the shock was immediate. One moment she was planning dinner, the next she was gone. Detectives searched her digital footprint. Her last text was a short message to one of her friends confirming dinner plans. After that, nothing. No calls, no emails, no social media updates. Her debit card and credit accounts showed no activity. Police pulled her rideshare and transit records, but there was no sign she had left the area. It was as if she had been swallowed whole by the building. The apartment itself revealed no forced entry, no broken locks, no signs of a struggle. But the details were strange, the door being locked from the outside, her phone abandoned, purse untouched, keys missing. To investigators, this suggested someone else had control, someone who either had access or knew how to manipulate the building's security. As hours turned into days, the story gripped the city. A young woman vanishing from her own apartment in the heart of Chicago, in a building with cameras, locks, and dozens of residents. Her family gave emotional pleas on television, begging anyone with information to come forward. Volunteers organized search parties that scoured parks, alleys, and riverwalks. Yet there was no trace, no clue pointing toward where she might have gone. And with every unanswered question, fear spread. If she could disappear without a trace from a secure apartment downtown, who else could it happen to? The case was no longer just about one missing woman. It was about a city wondering how someone could vanish into silence from a place where safety was supposed to be guaranteed. That silence was only beginning. In the first 24 hours, detectives knew they were fighting against time. Missing person investigations were often decided in those early hours, and already too many had slipped away. When police arrived in greater numbers the morning after she failed to appear for dinner, the building transformed from an ordinary downtown residence into the center of a mystery that demanded answers. Officers set up a temporary command post in the lobby, their radios crackling as detectives began canvassing floor by floor, knocking on doors and questioning anyone who had been awake late into the night. The initial sweep raised more questions than it answered. Several residents claimed they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, while others hesitated, their memories blurred by the ordinary noise of a high-rise in the city. One neighbor mentioned hearing the faint slam of a door near midnight. Another recalled the sound of heavy footsteps in the stairwell, but no one could say for sure if it had been her. The building's night security guard admitted he hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary, though his routine that night had kept him away from the residential floors. What the police needed most, clear eyewitness accounts, was missing. Attention quickly shifted to the cameras. Chicago was a city built on surveillance, and this building was no exception. Detectives pulled feeds from the lobby, the parking garage, and the exterior doors. Hours of footage revealed what they already knew. She entered the building just after 6 in the evening, appearing calm, carrying her work bag and keys. She greeted the doorman politely before heading to the elevator. After that, the feed offered nothing. She was never seen leaving. The cameras at the front entrance, the garage, even the side alley exit, all failed to capture her departure. For a young woman living alone in a modern building, surrounded by technology designed to prevent exactly this kind of disappearance, the gap was chilling. Elevator records revealed something stranger still. At 12:07 a.m., someone had taken the service elevator from her floor to the basement garage. Less than 10 minutes later, the elevator returned empty. Maintenance logs showed no authorized staff at that time. Whether it was her or someone else, the building's security system had caught the movement, but offered no picture of who had pressed the button. The digital trail was both a clue and a dead end. While investigators wrestled with gaps in the timeline, her family and friends clung to hope that she might still be found nearby. Volunteers organized quickly, printing hundreds of flyers with her photograph, smiling, professional, easily recognizable. They blanketed the surrounding blocks, taping them to light poles, bus stops, and the glass walls of train stations. Friends knocked on businesses up and down the street, leaving copies behind counters and in break rooms. Every passerby became a potential witness, every stranger, someone who might have seen her on the night she vanished. The search stretched outward. Teams of volunteers combed alleys and side streets, branching off from the building. Some walked the length of the Chicago Riverwalk, peering into stairwells and under bridges. Others checked parking garages, dumpsters, even construction sites left vacant overnight. They called her name into the dark, their voices carried by the sound of traffic and the river below. Despite the urgency and the sheer number of eyes scouring the area, nothing surfaced. Detectives followed up on every lead, no matter how tenuous. Reports of a woman matching her description boarding a bus were checked and dismissed. Rumors she'd been seen in a nearby bar unraveled when footage proved otherwise. Anonymous calls claimed she had been spotted walking toward the train station, but ticket records showed no purchase in her name, no trace of her entering. Each possible lead collapsed under closer inspection, leaving investigators with the unsettling realization that she had disappeared entirely within the walls of her own building. Her mother, who had rushed into the city that night, spent the following days camped near the command post. She refused to leave until she had answers, speaking to every detective who would listen, reminding them of who her daughter was. Family and friends rotated through, bringing coffee, folding flyers, and taking shifts with the search groups. They believed that if they just worked fast enough, if they shouted loud enough, she could still be found alive. But as the hours bled into days, that hope began to fracture. National news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting her face across the country. The coverage brought more tips, but none that held weight. The building became a spectacle, news vans parked permanently outside, reporters jostling for interviews with tenants. Detectives worked under the pressure of flashing cameras and public scrutiny, knowing the trail was already going cold. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted frustration. They had an apartment sealed like a box, belongings untouched, no signs of forced entry, and yet no sign of her. They had cameras that caught her arrival, but not her exit. They had an elevator log suggesting late-night movement, but no witness who could confirm who was inside. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces, and each failed lead chipped away at their confidence. The first wave of search ended where it began, with the building itself. For all the citywide effort, for all the volunteers combing through streets and riverbanks, the investigation kept circling back to the same locked door, the same blind hallway, the same unanswered question. How could someone vanish so completely from a place surrounded by people? That question would only grow darker as the investigation deepened. With the first wave of search exhausted, detectives began to look inward. When a young woman vanished from a locked apartment with no clear trace, the most logical place to start was the people who knew her best. Investigators began sifting through her personal life, one name at a time, searching for the weak link that might explain her disappearance. The first to come under scrutiny was her ex-boyfriend. Their relationship had ended just 6 months earlier, but friends described it as turbulent in its final days. He had a reputation for jealousy, calling too often, showing up unannounced, even sending angry messages when she didn't respond quickly enough. To detectives, he was a natural first suspect. They brought him in for questioning, pressing on the night of her disappearance. Where was he after midnight? Who could confirm his whereabouts? He insisted he was home, sleeping, and his phone records seemed to back it up. GPS data placed him in a suburb nearly 20 miles away, his phone stationary for most of the night. It was enough to weaken suspicion, but not enough to erase it completely. Investigators knew that digital alibis could be manipulated, and jealousy was often a motive that tipped ordinary people into unthinkable actions. Next came the neighbor. Residents had long whispered about him, describing him as overly attentive. He lived just 2 doors down, a man in his 40s who seemed to know far too much about his neighbors' schedules. Friends of the missing woman recalled her discomfort, mentioning how he lingered too long in hallways, how he always seemed to appear when she was coming or going. Detectives noted that his alibi was thin. He claimed to have been working late from home, sending emails into the early hours, but the timestamps showed gaps that were difficult to explain. His nervousness during interviews didn't help. He stumbled over details, contradicted himself, then backtracked. While none of it was definitive proof, it painted a picture that left detectives uneasy. Even her employer wasn't spared from scrutiny. At her marketing firm, colleagues hinted at rising tension in the weeks before she vanished. She had recently clashed with a manager over deadlines, and rumors circulated that she was considering leaving the company. Detectives wondered if workplace stress might have driven her to step away voluntarily, or if conflict at the office had escalated into something darker. The manager in question denied any serious dispute, portraying her as a valued employee, but investigators noted the defensiveness in his tone. Still, nothing tied him directly to the night she disappeared. Each interview added threads to a tangled web of possibilities. Each person seemed plausible in their own way. A jealous ex with a history of possessiveness, a neighbor who watched too closely, a workplace simmering with hidden conflicts. But as detectives dug deeper, every lead stalled against the same wall. Lack of evidence, no fingerprints, no clear eyewitness accounts, no digital trail leading beyond that apartment door. Her family watched helplessly as suspicion spread through her circle. Friends who had once leaned on each other now grew cautious, wondering if someone among them knew more than they admitted. The mother, sitting through each briefing, struggled with the notion that anyone close to her daughter could be capable of harm. She begged detectives not to overlook details, not to let someone slip away. At the same time, she recoiled at the thought of hearing one of those names tied forever to violence. Media coverage fueled the fire. Reporters seized on the details of her past relationship, painting the ex-boyfriend as unstable. Others ran with stories about the neighbor, interviewing tenants who described him as strange and obsessive. The public latched onto each theory as though certainty could be found in suspicion alone. For detectives, the attention was a double-edged sword. It kept the case alive in the headlines, but it also muddied the investigation, drowning out hard evidence with rumor and speculation. Behind the scenes, the pressure was relentless. Detectives knew that statistically, disappearances like this often traced back to someone close to the victim, but they also knew that pressing too hard on weak evidence could shatter the case in court. They needed more than character flaws, more than suspicion. They needed something that proved where she had been taken and who had taken her there. Days stretched into weeks, and with each passing one, the frustration mounted. The ex-boyfriend grew hostile at the repeated questioning, threatening to sue for harassment. The neighbor remained evasive, offering just enough detail to maintain his story. The employer faded from focus as work colleagues confirmed he had been out of town the night she vanished. Detectives circled these names like vultures, unable to land on the one that could finally crack the silence. For the family, the weight was unbearable. Every phone call brought the possibility of answers, but more often than not, it ended in disappointment. They were told repeatedly that progress was being made, that the circle was narrowing. But progress without evidence felt like a cruel illusion. Each suspect raised their hopes, each dismissal broke them again. By the end of that summer, investigators had interrogated every close contact, mapped out timelines, and tested every alibi they could. Still, they were no closer to an answer. The case, which had seemed so urgent and solvable in the first days, began to harden into something darker, a mystery where everyone could be guilty and no one could be proven to be. And just as the investigation seemed to stall, a forensic re-examination of her apartment would raise questions far more unsettling than any alibi could explain. As weeks slipped by, the urgency of the investigation collided with a wave of false leads that only deepened the frustration. The first came from a bus terminal on the city's south side, where a clerk swore he had seen a woman matching her description boarding a late-night Greyhound bound for Indianapolis. Detectives rushed to pull ticket records, security footage, and manifests. But the woman in the grainy video wasn't her. Similar build, similar hairstyle, but not the same face. It was the first of many sightings that would ignite hope and collapse just as quickly. Next came a tip about a taxi driver. A caller claimed to have overheard the driver bragging that he had taken a young woman from the Loop to a suburb west of the city the very night she vanished. The detail was specific enough to warrant attention. Detectives tracked down the driver, who denied everything. His logs showed fares that evening, but none from her building, and phone GPS records confirmed his route didn't match the story. Like so many tips that would follow, it was nothing more than rumor dressed as fact. Then there was the strangest theory of all, whispers that she had joined an underground cult. A co-worker came forward with what seemed at first like a disturbing revelation. Weeks before she disappeared, she had been researching fringe religious movements online, reading articles about groups that operated in secrecy. The co-worker suggested she may have been lured away willingly. Detectives followed the trail, pulling her search history, tracing the articles, and even contacting known organizations in the area. They found nothing linking her to any group, nothing suggesting she had planned to leave her life behind. What had seemed like a possible lead dissolved into coincidence, proof only of her curiosity, not her fate. For every promising lead, there were a dozen hollow ones. People called in sightings from train stations, diners, and shopping malls. Each report carried a spark of hope, and each ended with disappointment. Detectives began to admit what no one wanted to say out loud. They were circling the same empty hallway in her building, the same locked apartment door, with nothing to move them forward. The press, which had at first amplified the family's pleas for help, turned sharp. Headlines accused investigators of mishandling the case, of missing critical hours in the beginning, of failing to secure the building properly. Commentators speculated openly about corruption, cover-ups, or incompetence. Every press conference became a performance of defensiveness, detectives repeating the same lines. "The investigation is ongoing. We are pursuing all leads. We ask for patience." But patience was running thin. Inside the family, the strain grew unbearable. Her mother remained steadfast in her belief that foul play was involved. She clung to the details that made no sense: the locked door, the untouched purse, the missing keys. To her, they were signs of someone else's hand, someone who had taken her daughter against her will. But other relatives began to wonder if she had left by choice. They pointed to the workplace stress, the hints of restlessness, the internet searches about starting over. To them, it was possible she had orchestrated her own disappearance, slipping away from the weight of her life. Arguments broke out in private. At vigils, one side prayed for her safe return, while the other whispered doubts about whether she even wanted to be found. What had begun as a united front fractured into suspicion and resentment, each theory driving a wedge deeper into the family. Friends, caught between them, found themselves pulled into the same debate, trying to reconcile the woman they knew with the silence she left behind. Detectives felt the tension as well. Each new tip came with the weight of public expectation, and each failure eroded trust. Officers admitted privately that the investigation felt like quicksand. Every step forward only sank them deeper into doubt. They had the building secured, the records combed, the interviews logged, and yet nothing pushed them beyond that night. The case was no longer just about evidence, it was about perception, and the perception was bleak. By the third month, the case file had swelled into hundreds of pages, but the story inside was empty. Leads chased to exhaustion, suspects questioned and released, sightings proven false. What remained was a void, a young woman gone without explanation, and an investigation collapsing under its own weight. For her mother, each false lead was another blow, another day of waiting for a phone call that never brought answers. She spoke less to the media now, her voice worn thin, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Yet she refused to stop. She organized new searches, printed more flyers, begged detectives to keep pressing. To her, giving up was not an option. But for others in her circle, hope was harder to hold on to. Friends drifted away from the search groups, exhausted by the cycle of tips and dead ends. Some stopped attending vigils altogether, unable to face the silence that stretched further each day. The city, too, began to move on. New stories replaced hers in the headlines. The crowds outside the building thinned. What had once been a case at the center of public attention began to fade into the background of Chicago's endless news cycle. And still, behind the locked apartment door, the unanswered questions remained. Who had walked that hallway at midnight? Why did the cameras fail to capture her leaving? And how could someone vanish so completely from a building filled with people? It was those unanswered questions that kept detectives awake, long after the leads had dried up. Months after her disappearance, when the tips had gone quiet and the case seemed frozen in place, detectives made the decision to return to the one place that still held unanswered questions: her apartment. The unit had been sealed since the investigation began, its walls untouched, its furniture sitting exactly as she had left it. At first glance, it still felt like a young woman's life paused mid-step. Shoes aligned by the door, a half-finished grocery list pinned to the fridge, her phone charger plugged into the wall. But to crime scene technicians, the apartment was not a memorial. It was a puzzle waiting for a new set of eyes. They came with better tools, more time, and a determination to look beyond the obvious. Using ultraviolet light, they swept the bedroom. That was when they saw it. Faint streaks on the carpet, nearly invisible to the naked eye. They were irregular, angled as though something or someone had been dragged. The stains were too degraded for a definitive chemical match, but the shape alone was enough to raise alarm. Investigators had missed this in their first sweep, distracted by the pressure of the media and the rush to find her alive. Now, the marks whispered of a struggle that had once unfolded quietly on that floor. Near the bedroom window, they found something else, a partial palm print smudged along the frame, pressed with enough pressure to leave residue invisible in normal light. It didn't match hers. It didn't match her family. Detectives ran it through databases, hoping for a breakthrough. But no hit came back. Whoever had been in that room that night had left only a ghost of their presence, a half-print that suggested intrusion, but offered no name. The bathroom told a story of its own. Technicians noticed uneven coloration in the grout between tiles. A chemical test revealed traces of bleach absorbed deep into the porous surface. Bleach was common in cleaning, but here it raised darker questions. Why would someone need to scrub so intensely in the days leading up to her disappearance? Detectives suspected it wasn't routine housekeeping. It was an attempt to erase. The discoveries didn't bring relief. They brought dread. For the first time, the apartment felt less like a place she had vanished from, and more like the scene of something violent. Yet without a body, without DNA strong enough to tie anyone to the stains or the bleach, the case could not move into charges. Prosecutors warned detectives not to get ahead of themselves. Suspicion wasn't evidence. Traces and smudges weren't enough to present in court. Still, the investigators pressed on. They interviewed neighbors again, this time armed with their findings. Had anyone noticed unusual cleaning smells drifting from her unit? Did anyone see maintenance staff near her apartment in the days before or after she went missing? A few recalled faint odors, something sharp, chemical, lingering in the hallway late at night. Others claimed to have heard water running for long stretches in the bathroom. But memories months old were unreliable, and none of it rose above speculation. Her family's reaction to the new evidence was devastating. For her mother, the streaks on the carpet and the bleach in the bathroom confirmed what she had feared all along. Her daughter had been harmed inside the apartment. The idea of voluntary disappearance, once whispered among relatives, now seemed impossible. This was not the story of a woman who walked away. This was the story of someone who had been taken. Yet the family's relief at having their suspicions validated was immediately crushed by the knowledge that the findings led nowhere solid. They had answers, but not the kind that gave peace. The media seized on the details, reporting them with a mixture of intrigue and horror. Anchors described the eerie smudges and traces of bleach as though narrating a crime drama. The coverage reignited public interest, but also drew criticism. Commentators questioned why it had taken months to find these clues. Had investigators missed their chance in those first critical days? Had evidence been lost to delay and oversight? For the police, it was another blow to credibility, another shadow cast over an already fragile investigation. Behind the scenes, detectives admitted to feeling trapped. The evidence told them something had happened inside that apartment, something violent, something deliberate. But the lack of a body left the narrative incomplete. In missing persons cases, prosecutors demanded certainty, not theory. Without remains, without cause of death, every piece of circumstantial evidence could be dismantled in court. To move forward with charges would risk collapse, and collapse would mean the case was gone forever. As the months stretched on, that fear grew heavier. Files thickened with reports, photographs, chemical tests, but none of it carried the weight of finality. The palm print remained unmatched. The streaks on the carpet remained inconclusive. The bleach traces pointed to someone's hand, but not to whose. Each clue dangled just out of reach, like fragments of a story they couldn't quite finish. For the family, it was a new kind of torment. No longer was it only the absence of their daughter. It was the presence of shadows inside her home, reminders that she had likely suffered there, reminders that someone else had stood in those rooms. They wanted justice. They wanted a name. Instead, they were told the case was ongoing, words that sounded increasingly like unsolved. In the end, the forensic discoveries shifted the investigation, but did not resolve it. Detectives knew more than they had before, yet were powerless to move forward. The apartment had given up its secrets, but only halfway, revealing just enough to confirm the worst and not enough to prove it. and as the weight of the evidence stalled against the wall of uncertainty, the case began to teeter, balancing between possibility and silence, threatening to tip forever into the pile of unsolved files that haunt every major city. As the first year passed, the case slowly slipped from the front pages. What had once been the city's most urgent story began to fade into the background noise of other crimes, other tragedies. The anniversary of her disappearance was marked by candlelight vigils outside the apartment building. Dozens of people stood holding photographs, their voices hushed as they prayed, cried, and remembered. Reporters still came, their cameras capturing the flickering glow of candles against glass and steel. But the tone had shifted. It was no longer coverage of an active search. It was coverage of a family refusing to let go. Inside the police department, the file thickened, but progress thinned. Detectives rotated off the case, reassigned to new divisions or retiring altogether. Each new investigator who inherited the file had to climb the same mountain of old reports, stale leads, and inconclusive evidence. Many admitted privately that they believed the truth was buried for good. The building had been combed, the city scoured, the tips exhausted. Without a body, without a breakthrough, they were left with little more than shadows and suspicions. For her mother, silence was unbearable. She refused to let the case slip quietly into storage. She wrote letters to the police department month after month, begging for updates, pressing for action, reminding them of who her daughter was. Sometimes her letters were answered with polite assurances. The investigation remains open. More often they went unanswered, folded into the growing pile of correspondence attached to the case file. She didn't stop. To her, writing was the only way to fight against the silence that threatened to erase her daughter from memory. Every year, on the date she vanished, her family gathered outside the apartment building. Friends and strangers came too, carrying flowers and candles, leaving notes taped to the doors. Some brought photographs, others brought poems or letters they had written but never sent. For a few hours, the building transformed into a shrine, its lobby filled with echoes of a woman who had once lived there. But when the candles burned out and the crowd dispersed, the silence always returned. As time passed, the case took on a different kind of life, not in police reports, but in rumor. People whispered about the building itself. Some said it was cursed, a place where strange things had happened before. Others insisted she had been taken by someone who knew its layout too well, someone who understood the blind spots in the cameras, the service corridors, the back exits that residents never thought about. Tenants who moved in after her disappearance sometimes admitted to uneasy feelings, strange noises in the hall, the sense of being watched, the heaviness of knowing a woman had vanished from the same floor where they now lived. The building became a kind of urban ghost story. Tour guides leading late-night walks through downtown would sometimes point to it, lowering their voices to tell visitors about the woman who went in but never came out. Residents disliked the attention, but they couldn't escape the shadow that hung over the place. For some, it became unbearable, and they moved away, unwilling to live where a mystery lingered like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed clean. Her friends aged into new stages of life, marriages, children, careers. But every milestone was shadowed by the absence of the woman who should have been there with them. They admitted privately that they struggled to talk about her anymore, not because they had forgotten, but because remembering brought only pain. They carried her in photographs tucked into drawers, in memories that surfaced at unexpected times, in the quiet guilt of moving forward while she remained frozen in the past. Her mother, however, never moved forward. She became a fixture in the city's missing persons advocacy circles, speaking at events, sharing her daughter's story, pushing for reforms that might prevent other families from suffering the same fate. She kept her daughter's apartment key on a chain she wore around her neck, a reminder that one day the door might open again, though she no longer believed in miracles. What she wanted now was truth, even if it was unbearable. Over the years, small details would surface again. Rumors about the neighbor, whispers about the maintenance staff, speculation about hidden evidence. Each time, the family's hopes would flare briefly, only to be crushed when no new proof emerged. The cycle of hope and disappointment became its own kind of torment, as relentless as the silence itself. By the 5th year, The case was officially classified as cold. The file was moved into long-term storage, available for review, but no longer at the top of any active detective's desk. The mother marked the moment with another letter, this one addressed not just to the department but to the city itself. In it, she wrote that her daughter's story was not a cold case, not to her, not to anyone who loved her. She begged the public never to forget. Yet forgetting was what the city slowly did. New tragedies filled the headlines. The apartment building continued to stand, its windows reflecting the skyline, its lobby filled with new tenants who knew little of the woman who had vanished. For those who had lived through it, though, the memory lingered. When they passed the building, they felt the weight of it. When they walked its hallways, they wondered if answers were hidden just beyond reach. The silence across the years was not empty. It was heavy, haunted, filled with rumors and regrets. And in that silence, the case became more than a crime. It became a story woven into the city's fabric, a mystery that refused to die, waiting for the day when someone, somewhere, might finally break it open. 10 years passed before the case returned to life. By then, it had become one of those names mentioned only in passing, a footnote in Chicago's long history of unsolved mysteries. The file sat in cold case storage, its evidence boxed and sealed, its notes yellowing with time. For the family, the silence had become routine, though not any easier to bear. Every anniversary was marked with the same questions, the same unanswered pleas. Many believed the truth would never come. But a decade can change more than time. It can change technology. In 2025, a newly formed cold case unit decided to revisit the file. They came armed with tools unavailable in 2015, advanced imaging, enhanced forensic software, and access to expanded databases that had grown exponentially in 10 years. Their mandate was simple: take old evidence and look at it with new eyes. Among the first items they reviewed was the partial palm print smudged on the bedroom window frame. Back then, it had been too degraded to be useful. The technology of the time could not produce a reliable match. But now, digital enhancement tools could reconstruct incomplete prints with far greater accuracy. Investigators uploaded the scan, ran it through the new system, and waited. What came back was not vague, not a maybe. It was a hit. The print matched a man who had once worked as a maintenance employee in the very building where she vanished. His name had barely surfaced during the original investigation, buried among dozens of staff interviews that led nowhere. At the time, he had offered little more than generic answers about his routine: cleaning, minor repairs, responding to tenant requests. Nothing about him had stood out, nothing that tied him directly to her disappearance. But the system didn't forget what the human eye had missed. The smudged print on the window was his. Detectives began to reconstruct his timeline. Records showed that he had abruptly resigned from his job just weeks after she vanished. He told supervisors he was moving out of state for family reasons, but provided no forwarding address. Within a month, he disappeared from the city's employment rolls entirely. For nearly a decade, his name had lingered in databases but never flagged. Now it was lit like a beacon. The discovery jolted the investigation into motion. Detectives tracked down old co-workers from the building's staff. Several remembered him as odd, a man who sometimes worked late when no one else did, who seemed to know which apartments were empty and which tenants lived alone. One former employee admitted she'd filed a complaint against him for inappropriate comments, though nothing came of it at the time. Others recalled his temper, how he bristled when tenants challenged him, how quickly he lost patience with supervisors. The family was told about the breakthrough in a meeting at the police department. After 10 years of silence, they sat across from new faces, younger detectives who hadn't been there in 2015, but who spoke with quiet determination. They explained the match, the resignation, the suspicion that had grown with every new detail. For her mother, the words landed like both a relief and a wound. Relief that after all these years, someone's name could finally be tied to her daughter's disappearance. A wound because it confirmed what she had feared all along, that her daughter had not walked away, had not chosen to leave. She had been taken. News of the development spread quickly. Local outlets, then national ones, revived the story, running headlines about the breakthrough in downtown disappearance. Old footage of vigils and interviews was replayed on television, juxtaposed against the new revelation of a suspect's name. The public, who had nearly forgotten, was reminded of the woman who went into her building and never came out. For the detectives, the match was not the end. It was only the beginning. They knew they would have to build a case around more than a partial print. They needed corroboration, a trail that could hold in court, evidence that tied him not just to the building, but to the crime itself. They pulled his work logs, finding that he had signed in late the night she vanished. They combed through old maintenance records, discovering he had been assigned tasks in areas near her floor. Each detail layered suspicion thicker, but still stopped short of final proof. The city buzzed with speculation. Tenants who had once lived in the building were interviewed again, asked if they remembered him. Some admitted unease, stories of finding him in hallways where he didn't belong, of hearing his keys jingle as he moved through service corridors long after midnight. For years, these were just anecdotes, strange moments brushed aside. Now, they carried a different weight. The family stood once again in the center of public attention, their grief reopened for the cameras. They spoke cautiously, balancing gratitude for renewed attention with frustration that it had taken a decade for the truth to surface. The mother's voice cracked as she told reporters, "We knew someone had done this. Now we finally have a name." But names don't bring her back. For detectives, the work intensified. They traveled out of state, following the trail of the maintenance worker who had slipped away years before. They dug through records, tracked old addresses, spoke to people who had known him since he left Chicago. Each conversation painted a picture of a man who had started over, who lived quietly, never speaking of the years he spent working in that building. The reopening of the case was a moment of both clarity and uncertainty. Clarity that she had not vanished on her own, that foul play had taken her from her home. Uncertainty because they still had no body, no clear sequence of events, no weapon, no confession. But for the first time in a decade, the silence had broken. And in that break, the city realized the story was not over. It was only now beginning to reveal the face of the man who had walked those halls in the night she disappeared. Once the partial palm print led detectives to the former maintenance worker, the investigation shifted focus entirely onto him. For the first time in a decade, they had a name, a face, and the beginnings of a story that explained the silence. What they uncovered next darkened the case beyond what anyone had anticipated. Digging into his past, investigators discovered a pattern that had been overlooked. Records showed multiple complaints from female tenants during his employment at the building. Some accused him of making inappropriate comments while entering their units for repairs. Others recalled him lingering too long in hallways, appearing without being called, or using his master key to access apartments under the guise of routine maintenance. Most of these complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings or quietly filed away by management, eager to avoid conflict. But with the benefit of hindsight, the pattern was clear. He had been watching, testing boundaries, learning the habits of women who lived alone. His work logs revealed something more concrete. On the night she disappeared, he had signed out cleaning equipment and logged late-night entries to multiple apartments, including hers. While maintenance staff often worked irregular hours, the timing aligned too closely with her last known movements. When detectives questioned former co-workers, several recalled seeing him in the hallway that night, carrying a cart of cleaning supplies. One remembered it distinctly because it was unusual to see him working so late without another staff member present. These memories, faded by time, now resurfaced as critical details that had slipped through the cracks a decade earlier. The deeper detectives dug, the stranger his life became. After leaving Chicago abruptly, he had relocated to another state, taking up work under a different name. Public records showed he rented small apartments, worked sporadic jobs, and kept largely to himself. Neighbors described him as reclusive, sometimes unfriendly, but never openly threatening. To the casual eye, he was just another man trying to rebuild his life. but investigators believed he was hiding, staying under the radar precisely because of what he had done. The turning point came when detectives obtained a search warrant for a storage unit registered under his assumed name. Inside, they found what prosecutors would later describe as chilling. Among boxes of old tools and personal belongings were remnants of his time in Chicago, old building keycards, several still functional, bundled together with rubber bands. Notes scribbled in notebooks described maintenance schedules, tenant names, and cryptic observations about when certain residents were home or away. Some of the notes dated back to the year she vanished, raising the terrifying possibility that he had been keeping records of women in the building, monitoring their routines. For investigators, the discovery hardened suspicion into something darker. This was no longer a story of opportunity or chance. It suggested planning, obsession, and control. He hadn't just been a man working late hours. He'd been a man studying those around him, with access and authority that allowed him to move unseen. The family was briefed on the findings, and the impact was devastating. Her mother, who had begged for answers for 10 years, finally heard the details she had always feared. The keycards, the notes, the complaints, it all confirmed that her daughter had been targeted. She wept openly in the meeting, telling detectives she had always known someone in that building had taken her, but never imagined the extent of the obsession behind it. The public, too, reacted with shock. News outlets reported the details with heavy emphasis, highlighting the failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Why had the complaints from tenants not been pursued more aggressively? Why had his late-night logs not drawn closer scrutiny at the time? Each revelation pointed not only to his guilt, but to systemic oversights that let him slip through the cracks. Detectives now believed they were closing in on the truth, but they faced a grim reality. The man was dead. He had passed away several years earlier from an illness, leaving behind no confession, no chance to stand trial, no opportunity to face the family of the woman he had taken. What remained was the evidence, the palm print, the logs, the storage unit, the disturbing notes, that together painted a picture prosecutors were confident would have led to charges had he still been alive. For the family, the revelations were both relief and torment. Relief that their daughter had not simply disappeared without explanation, that her story now had a face and a pattern behind it. Torment because justice would never come. The man who had held the answers was gone, buried without ever being forced to speak. The case was no longer an open question of what happened. It had become something harder, a story of truth without accountability, a resolution that revealed everything yet closed nothing. Nearly a decade after her disappearance, when the investigation had already uncovered the name of the man believed responsible, fate delivered the final piece of proof. It happened not in a police lab or an evidence locker, but along the banks of the Chicago River, where a new property development was underway. Construction crews were clearing soil to lay foundations for high-rise apartments when a backhoe struck something unusual. Wrapped tightly in layers of deteriorating plastic, the bundle looked at first like discarded debris. But when workers cut into it, the truth emerged. Bones, tangled with fragments of clothing, preserved by time and secrecy. Police were called immediately, the site sealed off within hours. Forensic teams descended on the riverfront, carefully excavating the remains. It didn't take long for suspicions to turn into certainty. DNA confirmed what the city had whispered about for years. The remains belonged to the young woman who had vanished from her downtown apartment in 2015. The discovery ended a decade of not knowing, but it also raised darker questions about how close the truth had always been. The body had been wrapped in industrial-grade plastic sheeting, the kind used in construction or maintenance work. Soil analysis indicated the remains had been buried within days of her disappearance. There was no evidence of relocation, no sign she had been moved multiple times. Whoever placed her there had done so quickly, deliberately, and with knowledge of where development would not touch for years. It was a calculated hiding place, close enough to the city to avoid suspicion, but remote enough to buy time. Inside the wrapping, forensic teams found more than bones. Fibers were recovered, embedded in the plastic, clinging to fragments of her clothing. Laboratory testing confirmed they were consistent with the type of heavy-duty cleaning tarp once used by maintenance staff in her building. The tarp connected the burial site back to the place she had last been seen, and to the man whose storage unit had already yielded disturbing evidence of access and surveillance. For detectives, the link was undeniable. The palm print on her window, the late-night work logs, the key cards, and now the tarp. It all converged on the same conclusion. She had been attacked inside her apartment, her body removed under the guise of maintenance work, and concealed near the river in an attempt to erase her existence. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for 10 years, had finally aligned. The family was brought in for yet another meeting, this one different from the others. For years they had been told investigators were close, that progress was being made, but no words had ever carried the finality of what they heard now. Their daughter's remains had been found. There was no longer hope of her return, no chance of a miracle. Instead, there was the grim relief of answers that explained her silence, but at a cost no family should bear. Her mother's reaction was raw, a mix of collapse and vindication. For years she had written letters insisting her daughter had been taken, that something violent had happened in that apartment. Now, with the remains confirmed, her suspicions were validated. But the validation came hollow. The man responsible was already dead, beyond the reach of courts or prisons. Justice would never arrive in a courtroom. The family would bury their daughter, but never see the person responsible held accountable. News of the discovery reignited public interest. Headlines declared the Chicago River mystery solved, though detectives themselves cautioned against the word. Solved suggested closure, resolution. What they had was truth, but truth without consequence. Reporters described the chilling details of the tarp, the burial, the timeline. Commentators revisited the failures that had allowed the maintenance worker to slip through scrutiny, pointing out how close the evidence had been all along. For the city, the revelation tied off one of its most haunting urban legends. The woman who had vanished from a locked apartment was no longer a ghost story. She was a victim of violence, hidden by someone who understood the city's blind spots. The building where she lived would never escape the stain of her story, nor would the riverfront where her body was found. For her family, the discovery marked the end of waiting, but not the end of grief. They had her back, but only to bury her. They knew what had happened, but not why. The silence that had stretched for 10 years was broken, yet it left behind a deeper silence, the kind that follows when the person responsible is gone, when the answers arrive too late for justice. After a decade of silence, the case finally had its answer. With the discovery of her remains by the Chicago River and the fibers that traced directly back to the building's maintenance supplies, investigators were able to reconstruct what had happened the night she vanished. It was not a voluntary disappearance, nor an unexplained ghost story. It was an attack carried out inside her own apartment, hidden in plain sight, and covered up with chilling precision. Detectives determined that sometime after midnight, she was likely confronted in her apartment by the maintenance worker. He had access to her door, knowledge of her schedule, and the authority to be there without raising alarm. The faint streaks on the carpet, once dismissed as inconclusive, now told a clearer story. They believed she had been subdued, perhaps fatally injured, and then removed from the apartment. The service corridors that wove behind the main hallways provided the perfect escape route, allowing him to move unseen by cameras or neighbors. From there, her body was transported, wrapped in industrial plastic, and buried at the riverfront development site that he must have known was undisturbed at the time. The evidence was as close to a complete picture as detectives would ever have. The palm print on her window, the bleach traces in her bathroom, the fibers on her remains, the key cards in his possession, all threads tied back to the same man. The maintenance worker who had walked those halls at night, who had resigned abruptly after her disappearance, who had lived the rest of his life in another state under another name. The case was presented to prosecutors who agreed the evidence was strong enough to bring charges. A grand jury indicted him posthumously on charges of murder and unlawful concealment of a body. But the indictment was symbolic. He had died of illness years earlier, taking with him the possibility of cross-examination, confession, or even denial. There would be no trial, no verdict read aloud in a courtroom, no moment of justice for the family who had waited 10 years. When detectives delivered the news, the family sat in silence. Relief and devastation collided in the same breath. They finally knew what had happened, that their daughter had not left by choice, that her absence had always been the result of someone else's hand. But the knowledge came with no accountability. The man who had destroyed their lives was beyond reach, buried quietly without ever facing the truth of what he had done. Her mother wept as she clutched the folder of documents, pages filled with evidence that proved her daughter's fate. She told reporters later that the hardest part was not knowing why. Why her? Why that night? Why in a building where she should have been safest? Those questions would never be answered. The only thing left was the certainty of her death and the grim duty of burying her remains. The funeral took place on a gray afternoon, with family, friends, and strangers who had followed the case for years gathering together. They laid her to rest at last, placing flowers and photographs at her gravesite. For many, it was closure in the technical sense. Her body returned, her story told. But closure was not what it felt like. What lingered instead was a hollow silence, a sense of justice denied, of truth delivered far too late. The city reflected on the case with unease. How had a man with complaints on his record, with access to master keys, been overlooked for so long? How had the warnings, the odd behavior, the inconsistencies in his alibi not raised alarms back in 2015? The answers were difficult to face. Oversight, delay, and a system stretched too thin had allowed him to operate undetected, and a family had paid the price. For the building itself, the shadow never lifted. 10 years after she disappeared, tenants still whispered in its hallways about the woman who had gone in and never come out, about the service corridors that hid more than anyone realized. Even with the truth revealed, the place carried an echo of what it had concealed. In the end, the case closed with truth, but no justice. The family could bury their daughter, but they could not bury the torment of knowing her killer had escaped the one thing they had begged for all along: accountability. The silence that had stretched over 10 years had finally broken, but what replaced it was no less haunting. The echo of what the apartment hid remained, a reminder that some answers arrive only when it's too late to matter.